Good evening, morning, or night to anybody who follows this channel. Today, as part of our study of the Gospel of Matthew. I'm going to start with a brief introduction to the Gospels, um, and then from there we'll take it chapter by chapter, verse by verse, with each of the Gospels. Now, originally there were more than four Gospels written. But on the Synod of Rome in the year 382, the Catholic Church determined that only four of these Gospels were inspired by God. Years prior to that, we have other people like Irenaeus, Marcion, and a few others try and develop a canon, but it was finally official in the year 382. Now, these Gospels um, refer or talk about the life of Jesus Christ. In Greek, the word is evangelion, from eva, which means good, and angelion, which means to announce. In other words, a good announcement, the good news. What good news? That Christ came. So the four Gospels uh, relate the life of He who is our good news, Jesus Christ. Now, there were four main Gospels written: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Generally, it is conceived that Mark, even though it's the second one in the Bible, was the first one to be written. People now, Mark, Luke, and John are considered to be written in Greek. Matthew, however, the jury is still out. Most people accept that it was also written in Greek, but there's a strong and ever increasing movement, to which I belong, that claim that Matthew was originally not in Greek, but in Aramaic. Well, a lot of people claim it was in Greek because, first of all, it's easier to find Greek manuscripts of Matthew than it is to find the Aramaic um, document of Matthew. It is many people also claim that it's Greek because it was a language used in the time of Jesus. But there are few indications about and within the gospel itself that makes an appeal that it is not. That it was not originally in Greek, but in Aramaic, and then translated to Greek after the fact. Before I go into that, we need to understand what it's called, known as um, let's see, the synoptic dilemma. There is strong similarities between the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These three Gospels have strong similarities in the sequence and scope of certain events in the life of Jesus. The only difference is the amount of detail they provide. Mark, which is claimed to be the first one, is but 16 chapters long. It's a very, very short gospel. The biggest and longest gospel is Matthew, which has 28 chapters. It is considered the biggest, even though Luke is the most detailed one. Now, the question was, if Matthew, Mark, and Luke were writing miles away from each other and centuries apart, how come they are so similar? Originally, well, there are several ideas there. Or some people think that Mark wrote first and then Matthew and Luke copied from Mark, which is a possibility, and there is something to say about that. But I don't quite buy this because Matthew, why would Matthew, for example, who was an apostle, why would he be copying from Mark, who was not one of the 12, what Matthew was? Whether if Matthew was around Jesus, wouldn't he know already enough to be able to write about it without resorting to Mark, who was not one of the 12? That is my question, and that's my main reason why I don't think that why I don't believe the Mark primacy idea behind it. Another idea that many people think about why they are similar is what they call the dual source approach, um, in which supposedly there was a Q source from which Matthew, Mark, and Matthew, Mark, and John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, excuse me, copied. And then there was an original Aramaic Matthew, which Mark and Luke copied and Matthew translated. The dual source means the dual source theory would be that there was both a mysterious Q source and an original Aramaic gospel from which all three gathered information to develop their writings. Thirdly, there's a Q source, which means there was originally just one source from which all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, copied. And this source, once again, is called the Q source. Q for the word Quelle, German for the word source. The reason why they call it in German is because they developed this theory back in the 1800s when most of the biblical research was being done in German. Now, then there are some of us who, like me, believe that a Q source, but we believe that Q source was originally the Aramaic of Matthew. That Matthew had first written in Aramaic, then Mark and Luke copied it, and then Matthew translating his writings. A lot of people resist this idea because, as I said earlier, an Aramaic form of it is hard to come by, but it exists. It is so hard to come by that some people have claimed that there was no Aramaic, no Matthew in Aramaic. Well, to refute this idea that there was supposedly no Gospel of Matthew in Aramaic, we can easily refute this idea by quoting Dr. Robert Eisenman, director of religious studies in Cal State Long Beach, and an expert in first century Christianity and its Jewish roots. He tells us in one of his writings, because he has published several books, he tells us nobody denies the Aramaic Matthew unless they have vested interest in the Aramaic Gospel of Matthew not existing. In other words, he makes very strong claims that the Aramaic Gospel of Matthew existed, and if you don't want to accept that, according to Robert Eisenman, there's some weird reasons behind it why you would be denying it. Probably some anti-Semitic or racial inclinations. This is what Dr. Robert Eisenman claims. Furthermore, Dr. Stanley Jones, also um, in, uh, an instructor from Cal State Long Beach Department of Religious Studies, a specialist in early Christianity, and a member of what was called the Jesus Seminar, which studied about the historical Jesus and how that affected the different religions, the different Christian religions, obviously. Having said this, Dr. Stanley Jones tells us that indeed there is strong evidence for the Gospel of Matthew originally being in Aramaic. He even has a course in Cal State Long Beach where you learn Aramaic having nothing other than the Evangelion Tamfaresh, which is a Aramaic script, which is an Aramaic presentation of the Gospels, proving thus that there is an Aramaic form of Matthew to begin with, disproving those who deny it. There are other reasons why I strongly believe that Matthew was originally written in Aramaic and not in Greek, as some people claim. Part of it being that people like some of the early church fathers, like Papias, who wrote in the second century, tells us that Matthew wrote in his mother language. Eusebius of Caesarea, in the third volume of his work, Church History, tells us not once but twice that the Gospel of Matthew was written originally in Matthew's home language in the city of Syria. He tells us that Matthew originally preached in the country of Syria, excuse me, not Syria, country, in the country of Syria, um, and that now this is very telling because in Syria, a very specific dialect of Aramaic was used. It was called, you guessed it, Syriac. In other words, Aramaic from Syria. And according to Eusebius of Caesarea and Papias, this is the language in which Matthew wrote his gospel. And there are several linguistic information to believe that this is the case, which I will get to when we start looking at the Gospel of Matthew specifically. There are certain phrases that are contradictory for one if you know anything about Jewish culture. For example, why does the Bible talk about Simon the leper when lepers were not allowed to be inside the city? So hence, Simon the leper would not have been around, would not have a place to welcome people to celebrate the Passover. Lepers had to live in caves outside of the cities, not in a beautiful house on a hill that is frequented by a lot of people. Uh, the answer to that comes from the Aramaic word greva, which sounds like grava. One of them means leper, the other one means potter. We will look more into that when we get to those specific chapters. Plus, there are also certain expressions there that only exist in Aramaic, but when you translate it, it doesn't make as much sense. Now, so what language was Matthew written? take your pick. You can believe it that it was originally in Greek, like most people accept, or you can claim that it was written in Aramaic, like early church historians like Papias, who claimed it was originally in Aramaic. Papias wrote in the second century. This was just about 100 years. And he claimed he had a copy of the of the Aramaic Matthew. And you have Eusebius of Caesarea saying that the original language of Matthew was in Hebrew-ish. That's how he says it, Hebrew-ish or Aramaic, and then translated to Greek. And then when the original Aramaic disappeared, translated back to Aramaic. Now, there are also several other reasons. Eusebius of Caesarea even claims that when he was writing this around the 4th century, there was Aramaic Gospel of Matthew found in India. Which makes sense because Matthew was one of the apostles to India after having preached in Syria. There's also another cultural reason why many of us believe that it was written originally in Aramaic, mostly because of the conflicts between Gentiles and Jewish people. We know that he was writing for Jewish people. I will speak into that about that shortly. Um, if Matthew was writing for Jewish people, he would have written it in Aramaic more so than in Greek, considering the cultural conflicts that existed in the first century between the Greeks, Romans, and the Jewish community. Jewish community, when talking amongst themselves, they would use Aramaic. They would avoid use, especially around Antioch, which had a strong history of rivalry between Greeks and Jews. Um, Now, right there, when Jews would be talking amongst themselves, they would choose to use Aramaic, and they would only use Greek to access the economic world and the official professional world. Just like here in the United States, we have people who speak all sorts of languages, and a lot of us in the Hispanic community choose to use Spanish to talk to each other. But when we're talking about official business like government business, school, work, even though we know that person we're talking to speaks Spanish, we still use English for professional or official business as well. Same was what the Jews did. They would prefer to talk Aramaic amongst themselves, and then when communicating in professional or official, like when conducting commerce, speaking to or about the government, then they would use Greek. Now, if Peter was, I mean Peter, the if Matthew was Jewish, writing for the Jewish, he would have used Aramaic more so than Greek. These are the main reasons why I strongly believe it was written in Aramaic. And it will shed more light and more credence to many claims that are, up to this point, contradictory or at least controversial, but for lack of a better word, within the gospel itself. Now, having said this, now let's move on. Each of the four gospels was written by a different person for a different audience. Matthew was written by the apostle Matthew, also known as Levi, who happened to be a tax collector that Jesus called to be one of the 12. Mark, oh, wait, let me backtrack. Matthew was written by this time. Matthew lived in Syria, where the official language was Syriac or Aramaic. Syriac is one type of Aramaic. There is Syriac, there is Palestinian Aramaic, there's Chaldean Aramaic. These are the three main branches of Aramaic that existed in those days. Jesus would have spoken Palestinian Aramaic, but Matthew, born in Syria and preaching in Syria, would have preached Syriac, Syrian Aramaic. Now, Matthew was writing for the Jewish people. That's why we see a lot of references to the Torah in it. His main focus was presenting Jesus Christ as the promised Messiah from the Old Testament. We see that he starts right away talking about, first thing that he starts is talking about the genealogy of Jesus and how Jesus can trace his genealogy to David and then to Abraham. We see a lot of references in Matthew that says, as the prophet so and so said, as this prophet said, as the other prophet wrote in his book. We see that quoted a lot in Matthew. We don't see much of that in Mark, Luke, or John, because Matthew is trying to prove that that the life of Jesus Christ was actually predicted in the Old Testament. That is one of the reasons why when we talk about the symbols for the Gospels, each of the four Gospels has a symbol. The Gospel of Matthew is associated with the lion. You see, the lion was heraldic symbol for King David. There's a lot of talk of the Lion of Judah, which is Jesus Christ, because he comes from the tribe of Judah. It is made we see a reference for this towards the end of the book of Genesis in the prophecies that Jacob says about each of his grandchildren. And about Judah, he says, behold, Judah, a young lion, the scepter will not leave his hand till the, he who is sent to us, Shiloh, till the sent one comes. Now, until the Messiah comes. So the book of Matthew is represented by a lion because it is reflecting Jesus as the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, a descendant of the line of David, the son of David that was so prophesied. Mark, however, was not written by any of the apostles. Quite the opposite. The Gospel of Mark is written by a second generation Christian, namely John Mark. We see some references to John Mark. For example, when Peter gets out of prison and Paul's first missionary journey, we see references of Mark there. Mark was a secretary of Peter. And for a while, when Peter got to Rome, Mark was his secretary. This is until the point when Peter decides to send Mark to Egypt. And Mark becomes the first bishop of Alexandria and the founder of the Patriarchs of Alexandria. Once he arrives and starts preaching in Alexandria, According to Josephus, the people who heard the gospel being preached by Mark fell in love with the message, and they wanted a written reference to which they could resort every time they needed to. So Mark writes this gospel. And then, according to Eusebius of Caesarea, Mark sends a copy of it to Peter back at Rome to be approved and authorized, which it is, and then it starts getting promoted throughout Alexandria. The symbol of Mark is a man because it talks about the manhood of Jesus, how Jesus was born as a man of pain, the man of sorrows, prophesied in Isaiah 53. The Gospel of Luke, written in Greek by another person who was not one of the apostles, but this time a third generation Christian. Let's go back. Mark is considered second generation because Mark learned what he wrote in the Gospels from hearing Peter. So technically, some people ask, if Peter was the first pope, why didn't he write a gospel? Well, there's an argument that can be made that he did write a gospel indirectly through his secretary, Mark. After all, according to Eusebius of Caesarea, Peter still gave his approval of said gospel. Luke was not another of the 12. Luke was also a later addition to the church. It's actually written by a third generation Christian. You had the apostles, the original 12 apostles, who communicated the message to Paul, and then Paul communicated the gospel to Luke. And here, at this moment, Luke is the one who writes it down. Furthermore, Luke in his gospel in chapter 1 mentions a reference that there were people who were already trying to express and document the life of our Lord Jesus Christ. And Luke admits to having copied, interviewed, and done major research before writing the gospel. Luke says this in the introduction, in the first few verses of the Gospel of Luke. Now, whereas Matthew wrote for the Jews and Mark wrote for the people of Alexandria, Egypt, okay, Mark was writing for people who may not be Jewish but were of Jewish origin in Alexandria. Luke is the only one who wrote for exclusively Gentile people throughout the Greek speaking world, which included the Middle East in those days. The Gospel of Luke is represented by a bull. We see that it starts out talking about Zechariah offering sacrifice in the temple. And sacrifice is a big theme in the Gospel of Luke. Luke is also a a bull is also a sacrificial animal. When priests wanted to purify the temple, they would sacrifice a red cow. When a priest committed a sin, they would purify themselves by sacrificing a bullock. Thus, the bull represents a priestly sacrifice. And the Gospel of Luke emphasizes that. It starts out talking about a priest offering sacrifice in the temple. And throughout the Gospel of Luke, its theme is Jesus Christ as that priest who sacrifices that Lamb of God who happens to be himself. And as he was writing for the Gentiles, this was officially Greek, as was Mark. Mark was written in Greek, but some people have noticed that there are certain italicism, Latinisms involved in it. There are certain expressions that would only be explainable if there were some influence from Latin, which makes sense because um, Mark, as the secretary of the Bishop of Rome, that would make sense. These three books were written around the 80s, 83, 84, 85. The last of the four Gospels, the Gospel of John, is not a um gosh, I'm still asleep right now. It's so early in the morning. It's not a synoptic gospel. John is not a synoptic gospel because it does not reflect similarities with the other three. It's called more. It is called more like the spiritual gospel or the theological gospels because he addresses things that are a bit more theological, explaining what the phrase is like with the word of what the word living water refers to, explaining certain phrases that could only come afterwards once the church had been more or less, all things considered, established. It is called a spiritual and or theological gospel because it talks more about the theology behind Christ. It starts out talking about how it actually starts out talking, making references to the Trinity. For in the beginning there was God. The word was in the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God, and God was the Word. These are very profound references to Jesus Christ as before having been incarnated. And it makes a reference to Jesus as a part of the Trinity. So it's already addressing things that are very profound in theology. That that's also one of the reasons why the Gospel of John is symbolized with an eagle, because you could say it's flying above the other Gospels with its introduction of theology within its pages. John was definitely written in Greek, and it was written around what is now Turkey. Now, who was the Gospel of John written to or for? This is the first and only Gospel that does not specify for whom, or but it does specify for what purposes. The Gospel of John was written around the year 93, more or less. By this time, there were a few sects that have found been established, or we could call them cults that were beginning to develop. We need to understand this as we study the Gospels, the Gospel of John. By the time John wrote his Gospel, several cults had developed. Okay, the church had been spreading like wildfire throughout the empire. Many pagan priests lost control of their flocks as their flocks rejected pagan doctrine and accepted the teachings of the church. Now you started having these pagan priests pretending to convert, pretending to be baptized. We see an example of that in the book of the Acts of the Apostles with Simon Magus, um, who was one of such pagan priests who pretends to convert to Christianity. These pagan priests converted to their false forms of Christianity, started preaching all sorts of heresies. So John being one of the 12 apostles and the only remaining apostle at that time. All the other apostles died before the year 70. So now you have John, the only remaining apostle, 20 years after the death of the last one, um, thinking it was time for him to correct what was being said about the Gospels and confront the lies and heresies being spoken by these cults, such as um, the Catholics, who condemned the physical body of Christ, or other the Ebionites, who denied the spiritual nature, the divine nature of Jesus Christ. To combat both those doctrines, according to Eusebius of Caesarea, he looks at Matthew, at the Gospel of Matthew. He looks at the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Luke, which were written when these movements were not as popular yet, and decides to add what was missing in those three Gospels that could be used to refute pagan pseudo Christianity, also known as Gnosticism, which was becoming very popular. And that's the purpose why John writes this in the year 90, just about 5 to 6 years before his death. Matthew wrote, the purpose of Matthew was to convince the Jewish communities that Jesus is the Messiah. The purpose of Mark was to leave a running record of the life of Jesus Christ as the man of sorrows who walked the surface of the world. The Gospel of Luke was written with the purpose of, he says so himself, documenting the things as they were from the beginning of Christianity for the Gentiles. And the Gospel of John was written as a response to all the heresies that were beginning to develop. And to correct these heresies and teach more profoundly the word of our Lord. Long live Christ the King!